I used to be really good at starting over. Every few months, I would sit down with a fresh notebook or a new app full of genuine intention and build what felt like the perfect system, categories that made sense, allocations that were honest, a plan that, on paper, accounted for everything. And for about 2 weeks, sometimes 3, it worked. I felt organized. I felt like someone who had finally figured it out. And then life happened. Not a crisis, just the ordinary texture of a real month. An unexpected expense here, a week that was harder than usual, where cooking at home felt like too much and the budget took a hit, a category that didn't quite capture how things actually worked in practice. And slowly, without a single dramatic moment, the system would drift. The notebook would go unwritten in for a few days, then a week, then I'd find it 3 months later with 10 pages filled and the rest blank. I wasn't bad at managing money. I was using systems that were designed for a version of myself that doesn't actually exist, a version that is perfectly consistent, never tired, never overwhelmed, never human. The Japanese approach I stumbled into changed that, not because it is more sophisticated or more comprehensive, because it is simpler, genuinely, structurally simpler. And simplicity, I've learned, is not the starting point you graduate from when you're ready for something more advanced. Simplicity is the thing itself, the destination. There are 7 practices I now use. I call them secrets not because they're hidden, but because they're the kind of thing that seems obvious after you've heard it, and yet almost nobody in Western financial culture actually talks about. They have been part of Japanese households for generations, and they have made my budget not just cleaner, but genuinely easier to live inside. Let me share them with you. The first is something I now do every single morning, and it takes less time than waiting for coffee to brew. The Japanese call the broader principle Asaichi no Kakugo, morning readiness, the practice of beginning each day with a moment of intentional preparation before the day's demands arrive. Applied to money, it becomes the simplest possible financial habit, a morning glance. Not a review, not an analysis, a glance. Every morning, before anything else has happened, I open my banking app and look at my balance. I don't do anything with that information. I don't make decisions, I don't move money, I don't compare it to what it should be. I simply look at the number that is actually there, in the account, right now, in this moment. That single habit changed my entire relationship with money, and I didn't understand why until I learned about the Japanese concept of Genchi Genbutsu, a principle used in Japanese manufacturing that means go and see for yourself. Don't rely on reports or assumptions or secondhand information. Go to the place where the thing actually is and observe it directly. Most of us do not practice Genchi Genbutsu with our finances. We carry a general impression of our balance, a vague sense of roughly how much is there, formed from the last time we checked, filtered through whatever has happened since. And that impression is almost always slightly wrong, sometimes more wrong than we'd like to admit. Think about navigating a city by memory versus by looking at a map. If you grew up in a city, you can move through it from memory most of the time. But if you're making an important turn, you look at the map. You don't trust the impression, you check the reality. And the 30 seconds it takes to verify is almost always worth it. The morning glance is looking at the map. It grounds you in the actual number before the day begins spending from whatever impression you're carrying. And over time, it builds something invaluable, an accurate intuition about your own finances. You stop being surprised by your balance because you've been watching it move every day in real time. It costs less than 60 seconds. And it is, without question, the habit that made every other financial practice I have more effective, because everything else I do happens against a background of accurate awareness rather than comfortable assumption. Try this. Tomorrow morning, before you open any other app, open your bank account and look at the balance. Just look. Don't judge it, don't plan around it. Simply know it. Do that every morning for 2 weeks and notice what shifts. The second secret comes directly from the Kakeibo, the Japanese household budget journal created in 1904 by Hani Motoko, a journalist who wanted to help Japanese women gain financial clarity and independence in an era when women rarely controlled household finances at all. Motoko's insight was not about accounting. It was about the power of a single, honest question asked before money is spent. The question is this: do I need this or do I want this? In the Kakeibo, every expense falls into one of 4 categories: needs, wants, culture, and unexpected. The needs versus wants distinction is the first and most important filter, not because wants are bad or wrong, but because knowing which category you're in when you spend changes the quality of the decision. When you know you're spending on a want, you spend differently. Not necessarily less, but more consciously. The purchase is acknowledged for what it is, a choice made from desire, not necessity. And that acknowledgement, that small moment of honesty, is what separates spending that feels good from spending that creates regret. I started using this question not to stop myself from buying things, but to understand what I was buying and why. And what I discovered was startling in its simplicity. Most of my budget anxiety came not from spending too much on needs or too much on wants, but from spending on wants while telling myself they were needs. The mental friction of that small dishonesty, of justifying a desire as a requirement, was costing me more than the money itself. It's like the difference between saying, I'm taking a day off because I need rest, and I'm taking a day off because I want rest. The day is the same, the rest is the same, but one version is honest, and one is slightly ashamed of itself. And the one that's ashamed of itself never feels as restful as it should. When you can look at a purchase and say, clearly and without judgment, this is a want and I'm choosing it, that is financial clarity. That is what the Kakebo's 4-category system produces, not restriction, honesty. And honesty, practiced consistently, produces peace in a way that restriction never can. Try this. For 1 week before every non-essential purchase, ask the Kakebo question out loud or in writing, need or want. Don't use the answer to stop yourself. Use it only to know. Awareness before action is where all genuine change begins. The third secret is one I resisted for longer than I should have, because it sounded too simple to be meaningful. It is called Kakebo no Te, the hand of the household ledger, and it means, simply, write it by hand. Not in an app, not in a spreadsheet, by hand, in a physical notebook with a pen. I know how this sounds. We have phones that can categorize transactions automatically, sync across devices, generate charts, send notifications. Why would writing things down by hand be an upgrade? Because the hand and the brain are connected in a way that a touchscreen is not. When you write something by hand, you process it differently, more deeply, more memorably, more personally. This is not philosophy, it is neuroscience. Studies from Princeton University and the University of California found that students who took notes by hand retained and understood information significantly better than those who typed, because handwriting forces you to slow down and synthesize rather than simply transcribe. The same mechanism applies to money. When you type a number into an app, you are recording information. When you write a number by hand, you are experiencing it. The $340 you spent on dining out this month feels different when you write it in your own handwriting, in your own notebook, than when it appears as a bar in a chart you barely look at. The Kakebo has been a handwritten practice for over 120 years. It has survived the calculator, the spreadsheet, the budgeting app, not because the Japanese are resistant to technology, but because the act of writing by hand produces a quality of financial awareness that technology has not yet replicated. I use a simple notebook, nothing special, a small, clean notebook that I keep on my desk and that takes me about 5 minutes each evening to update. And the 5 minutes of handwriting does more for my financial clarity than any of the hours I previously spent inside budget apps that did the work for me. Because here's the thing, when the app does the work, the clarity belongs to the app. When your hand does the work, the clarity belongs to you. Try this. Buy a simple notebook, any notebook, and for the next 30 days, write your daily expenses by hand each evening. Total amount spent, 2 or 3 words describing what it was for. Nothing more complex than that. At the end of 30 days, notice whether your relationship with those numbers feels different from how it felt when they lived only in an app. The fourth secret sits at the intersection of Japanese psychology and financial behavior, and it is the one that most surprised me when I first encountered it. It is called Jibun e no Kyoka, permission to yourself, and it is about the practice of deliberately including enjoyment in your budget, not as an afterthought, not as whatever is left over, but as a designed, honored, intentional category. Most budget systems treat personal enjoyment as the enemy of financial responsibility. The logic is, the less you spend on things you enjoy, the faster you build savings. And so, enjoyment gets cut, trimmed, justified out of existence, and then, inevitably, explodes in a moment of frustration where you spend much more than you would have if you'd just allowed yourself the small thing in the first place. Japanese household budgeting, particularly through the Kakebo framework, takes a fundamentally different view. The culture category in Kakebo, which includes entertainment, experiences, books, art, anything that enriches the inner life, is not optional. It is structural. It is there from the beginning, alongside needs and wants, because the Japanese have long understood that a life with no allocation for beauty and enjoyment is not a financially responsible life. It is an unsustainable one. Jibun e no Kyoka says, give yourself permission, formally and specifically, to spend on what brings you joy. Not infinitely, not recklessly, but deliberately, within a defined space, without guilt. Think about a garden with a designated flower bed and a designated vegetable bed. The vegetables are practical, they feed you. The flowers seem optional, they only delight you. But a garden with only vegetables and no flowers is a farm, not a garden. And most people, given the choice, don't want to live on a farm, they want a garden. The flowers are not a luxury that happens after all the vegetables are planted. They are part of what makes the garden worth tending. Your budget is a garden. Jibun Enokyoka is the flower bed. When you build it in deliberately, even if it's small, even if it's $30 a month designated only for things that make you happy, something profound happens. The rest of the budget becomes easier to honor because you are no longer in conflict with it. You are not a person depriving yourself and waiting for permission to live. You are a person who has given themselves permission, formally, structurally, honestly, and who finds it much easier to be disciplined in every other area as a result. Try this. Look at your next month's budget and add one line that does not yet exist, a line for something that brings you genuine joy. Give it a small, specific amount. Name it something that makes you smile when you read it. Then spend it entirely, without guilt, on exactly what you said it was for. Now, this might seem like the most counterintuitive financial advice you've heard, but what comes next goes even further, and it is the secret that quietly holds everything else together. The fifth secret is one of the most distinctly Japanese practices in this entire list, and it requires nothing more than a single drawer and a single envelope. It is called Fukuro Bunke, envelope separation, and it is a system that Japanese families have used to manage irregular expenses for generations. The principle is simple. Money for irregular expenses, the annual car registration, the quarterly insurance premium, the birthday gifts, the holiday spending, does not come from the monthly budget when those expenses arrive. It is set aside in advance, gradually, in a physical envelope designated for that specific expense. Western budgeting almost universally fails at irregular expenses. We budget for monthly bills, rent, utilities, subscriptions, because they are predictable and recurring. But we treat irregular expenses as surprises, even when they are entirely predictable, simply because they don't occur every month. The car registration is not a surprise. The winter heating bill is not a surprise. The flights home for the holidays are not a surprise. They happen every year at roughly the same time for roughly the same cost. And yet most of us experience them as financial emergencies. Fukuro Bunke eliminates that experience. You identify every irregular expense you can anticipate, however far in advance, divide the total cost by 12, and set that amount aside each month in a designated envelope or a designated savings pocket. When the expense arrives, the money is already there, not borrowed, not stressed about, not paid on a credit card and carried forward as debt. Simply there, already prepared, the way a well-run household prepares. It's like a Japanese kitchen mise en place, the professional chef's practice of preparing and arranging all ingredients before cooking begins, so that the act of cooking can proceed without interruption or scrambling. The chaos of a recipe that requires you to chop an onion while something else is burning on the stove is not inevitable. It is the result of not having prepared. Mise en place, like Fukuro Bunke, transforms chaos into calm through preparation rather than reaction. I now have 6 envelopes, some physical, some digital sub-accounts, for different irregular expenses. Car-related costs, medical, gifts, travel, home maintenance, annual subscriptions. Each month, small amounts go into each, and when those expenses arrive, they are not crises. They are simply the arrival of something I already knew was coming. Try this. Write down 3 irregular expenses you know are coming in the next 12 months. Divide the total cost of each by 12. This is the monthly amount you need to set aside, starting now, so that each of those expenses arrives already funded. Open a separate savings account or a physical envelope for each, and make the first transfer today. The 6th secret is one that sounds more philosophical than practical, and it is. But the Japanese would argue that the best financial practices always are. It is drawn from the concept of shizen, naturalness, and the broader Japanese principle that the most sustainable systems are those that work with the nature of things rather than against it. In personal finance, shizen means building a budget that works with the actual shape of your life. Not the ideal shape, not the aspirational shape, but the real one. The one that includes the weeks when you're exhausted and cooking at home genuinely isn't possible. The one that includes the seasonal variations in mood and spending. The one that includes who you actually are, not who you think you should be. Most budget failures are not failures of discipline, they are failures of design. We design budgets for an idealized version of our lives, flat, consistent, predictable, and then our actual lives, with their hills and valleys and unexpected turns, break the design within weeks. Shizen asks, what is the actual shape of your spending across the year? Not what you wish it were, what it actually is. Are there months that are consistently more expensive? The holidays, the summer, the beginning of the school year? Are there weeks when you reliably spend more on food because of how that week feels? Are there categories that always overflow, regardless of how carefully you've planned them? Once you can see the actual shape, the real contours of how money moves through your specific life, you can build a budget around that shape instead of against it. Not a budget that forces you to be consistent when your life is seasonal. A budget that acknowledges the season, plans for it, and works with it rather than being surprised by it every time it arrives. I spent years being surprised by December. Every December, my budget broke in the same ways for the same reasons, and I treated it each time as a failure of the current system rather than as evidence that the system needed to include December's reality from the start. Once I mapped my actual year, with its predictable surges and its quieter months, and built a budget that honored that map, December stopped being a crisis and became just another month, one I had planned for honestly. Try this. Look back at your spending over the last 12 months and identify the 2 or 3 months that were consistently, significantly more expensive than average. Write down why, specifically. Then look at next year's calendar and mark those months in advance. When the time comes to build those months' budgets, start from a higher baseline. Work with the shape. Stop being surprised by the calendar. The seventh and final secret is the one I return to most often, not because it is the most practical, but because it is the most clarifying. It comes from a teaching that appears in different forms across several Japanese traditions, and in the context of household finance, it was articulated most clearly in the writings of the Edo period philosopher Kaibara Ekiken, who wrote in the late 1600s about the relationship between simplicity and sufficiency. The secret is this: know your number, not your net worth, not your retirement target, not the salary you want or the savings rate you aspire to. Your number, the specific, honest, monthly amount that your actual life, lived simply and well, actually costs. Kaibara Ekiken wrote about the importance of what he called Chido, knowing the way, as the foundation of any well-lived life. And in financial terms, knowing the way begins with knowing this number. Because until you know it, until you have sat down and calculated, honestly and specifically, what your life actually costs each month when it is lived at the level of genuine sufficiency, you are navigating without a destination. Most of us have never done this calculation. We have a general sense that we spend roughly a certain amount, and we compare that vaguely to what we earn, and we feel either relieved or anxious, depending on which number feels larger. But we have never sat quietly with the question, what does my life, lived in a way that feels genuinely good and genuinely sustainable, actually cost? The number is different from your current spending. It is not what you actually spend, which includes the drift, the impulse purchases, the unconscious decisions made from tiredness or habit. It is what your life would cost if you were spending with full attention and full intention on the things that matter and at the level that genuinely serves you. When you know this number, when you have arrived at it through honest reflection rather than wishful thinking, everything about budgeting becomes simpler. Because you have a reference point, not a restriction, not a punishment, not an aspiration, a reference. The number that your life is organized around. The number that tells you whether you're inside your life or outside it, financially speaking. Think about an architect who has designed a building to a specific set of proportions. Every decision about the building, where the walls go, how the rooms relate to each other, what can be added and what can't, is made in relationship to those proportions. The proportions are not a limitation. They are the structure that makes every other decision clear. Your number is your proportions. And the clarity that comes from knowing it is the foundation on which every other financial habit becomes not just easier, but meaningful. Try this. Sit down this week with a blank piece of paper and calculate as honestly and specifically as you can what your life costs at the level of genuine sufficiency. Not your current spending, your actual life, lived well, without waste and without deprivation. Add up the categories honestly. Arrive at a monthly number. Write it down. Look at it. That is the number your budget is trying to protect. 7 secrets. And looking at them together, what strikes me most is that none of them ask you to spend less, not one. They ask you to see more clearly, to know your balance, to name your spending honestly, to write things by hand so they become real, to give yourself permission to enjoy, to prepare for what you know is coming, to work with the actual shape of your life, to know the number that your life is built around. The Japanese approach to budgeting has survived centuries not because it is strict, but because it is honest. It does not ask you to become someone else. It asks you to become more fully yourself. More aware, more present, more intentional in the ordinary daily movements of money through your life. And simplicity, I have found, is not where you start before things get complicated. Simplicity is where you arrive when you finally understand what actually matters. The budget that works is not the most sophisticated one. It is the one you can actually live inside. Not because it demands nothing of you, but because what it demands is so well matched to who you actually are that it no longer feels like demand. It feels like home. So I want to leave you with one question to carry into this week. Of these 7 practices, which one describes something your budget has never had? And what would it feel like to finally build it in? If this way of thinking about budgeting feels different from what you've tried before, more human, more honest, more quietly Japanese, This channel was built for exactly this conversation. Every video here explores the practices and philosophies that make financial simplicity genuinely possible, without perfection, without shame, and without the pressure to overhaul everything at once. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring this together. There is so much more here waiting for you.